My wife laughed. "You'll never find out. I just waited for the right moment to show her." She laughed when she said it. Not a nervous laugh, not a slip of the tongue she immediately regretted, a real laugh. Confident, almost pitying, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "You'll never find out, Daniel," she said, refilling her wine glass in our kitchen on a Tuesday night in March. What she didn't know was that I already had. I'd known for 11 weeks. I just hadn't decided yet what to do with it. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I'm 38 years old. I work as a forensic auditor for a mid-sized investment firm in Chicago. The kind of job where companies bring me in after they suspect something's wrong with their books, and my entire function is to find the exact place where a number stop telling the truth. I've spent 13 years learning to read financial statements the way most people read faces, for the small inconsistency that gives away the larger lie underneath. I never expected that skill to end up pointed at my own marriage. But that's the nature of the work. It doesn't clock out with you. I want to tell this properly, from the start, because the ending only carries weight if you understand how long the middle actually was. Sabrina and I met 9 years ago at a mutual friend's fundraising gala downtown. She was a real estate broker even then. Sharp, magnetic, the kind of person a room reorganizes itself around without anyone quite noticing it happening. I was standing near the bar, badly holding a conversation with someone about municipal bonds. When she walked over, took the drink out of my hand without asking, tasted it, made a face, and said, "This is terrible, come find the good bar with me." I did. We were married 2 years later. For a long stretch, 5 years, maybe 6, it was a genuinely good marriage. Not without friction. We argued about money sometimes, about how much of our savings should go toward the house renovation versus her business expansion versus my retirement contributions. The ordinary disagreements of two people building something together. But underneath the friction there was real partnership. We took a trip to Portugal for our 3rd anniversary that I still think about more than I probably should. We had a standing Sunday morning ritual, coffee on the back porch. The newspaper split between us, Sabrina reading the real estate section out loud in a mocking radio announcer voice that always made me laugh no matter how many times she'd done the bit before. I think about those years in specific, small fragments now, the way you do with a period of your life that's ended, not the big milestones, but the ordinary texture of it. Sabrina used to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror before early client showings. Little reminders or jokes meant for me to find when I got up. She kept a running scoreboard, entirely invented, of which one of us was winning at marriage that month. Based on criteria she made up on the spot and changed whenever it suited her. We adopted Chester together in our 2nd year, both of us insisting separately that we hadn't really wanted a dog until the moment we saw him at the shelter and neither of us could leave without him. There was a version of us, for a real number of years, that worked, not perfectly. But honestly, in the way two people building something together usually have to work through friction rather than around it. I want to establish that clearly before anything else, because I think stories like this one get told in a way that makes the good years sound like a lie in retrospect. They weren't. They were real. What came later didn't erase them. It just ended them. The shift, when I look back now, started roughly a year and a half before that Tuesday night in the kitchen, slow enough that I couldn't point to a single day and say, there, that's when it began. That's the nature of erosion. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly changes the shape of the ground you're standing on until one day you notice you're somewhere different than where you started. The first thing I noticed was Sabrina's calendar. She'd always kept her professional schedule loosely shared with me, mostly so I'd know when to expect her home for dinner. Around that year and a half mark, entries started appearing simply as client, confidential, with no address, no name, no timeframe beyond a start time. When I asked, she'd say something about a high net worth buyer who valued discretion, which, in her line of work, wasn't an unreasonable explanation on its own. I let it sit. Then there were the evenings. 2, sometimes 3 nights a week, she'd come home later than usual, 8:30. Sometimes past 9 o'clock, with an explanation that always sounded plausible in isolation and increasingly threadbare in aggregate. Showing ran long. Client wanted to walk the property twice. Traffic on the Kennedy was brutal. I stopped pressing for details after a while, not because I believed her fully, but because the follow-up questions never led anywhere except a slightly more elaborate version of the same vague answer. She started dressing differently too, not dramatically, but noticeably, to someone paying attention. New blazers, a different perfume, one I didn't recognize, warm and smoky in a way that didn't match the light florals she'd worn for years. I remember standing in the bathroom one morning, watching her apply it at the mirror, and asking, casually, where she'd picked it up. A boutique downtown, she said. Client recommendation. I nodded and said nothing else, though something in my chest had already started keeping a quiet, careful record. The detail that first genuinely unsettled me came from her business partner, a woman named Ruth Halloway who'd known Sabrina since before I did, and who I ran into at a grocery store one Saturday morning, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee. We made small talk about the weather, about her kids, and then Almost as an afterthought, she said, "Tell Sabrina I said hi. I feel like I barely see her anymore between all her Riverton showings." I didn't recognize the name Riverton. Sabrina's brokerage didn't handle listings in Riverton. It was a suburb 30 minutes outside her usual territory. One she'd never once mentioned to me in 9 years of marriage. I thanked Ruth, finished my shopping, and sat in my car in the parking lot for a long moment afterward, turning the name over in my mind. Riverton, a place Sabrina supposedly kept visiting for work, that her own business partner seemed to think was unusually frequent. That I'd never once heard her mention by name. I didn't confront her. I want to explain why, because I know how that choice reads from the outside, like weakness. Or like I was constructing some elaborate trap purely for the satisfaction of it. It's neither. My entire professional discipline is built around a single rule. If you tip off the source of a discrepancy before you understand its full scope, you lose the ability to trace it accurately. People adjust their behavior the moment they know they're being watched. The books get cleaned up. The story gets rehearsed. I wasn't going to make that mistake in my own home before I understood what I was actually looking at. So I watched, quietly, the way I'd been trained to. I started noting which days corresponded to the client, confidential, calendar entries. Cross-referencing them, in my head at first, against which evenings she came home late. Which nights her phone stayed face down on the nightstand instead of charging on the kitchen counter the way it always had. 3 weeks after the conversation with Ruth, I called my closest friend, Marcus Feld, a divorce mediator by profession, which made him either the best or worst person to call about a marriage. I've never fully decided which. I told him everything, the calendar entries, the late evenings, the perfume, Riverton. "How long have you actually known something's off?" he asked. "A few months, loosely." "The Riverton thing, 3 weeks. A pause. "And you haven't asked her directly?" "Not yet." "Good," he said, in the same careful tone he probably used with 100 clients before me. "Don't. Not until you know what you're actually dealing with. People don't get to rehearse a story you haven't given them a reason to build yet." What I hadn't told Marcus, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that 4 days earlier, I'd done something I'm still not entirely at peace with. Though I don't regret it. Sabrina's laptop, an older model she used mostly for personal browsing since her brokerage issued her a separate device for client work, had been left open and unlocked on the kitchen counter while she showered. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I saw a browser tab open to a property listing site, a single address in Riverton. A modest 4-bedroom colonial that had been off market for over a year according to the listing history visible on the page. Not an active client showing. A property that wasn't for sale. I closed the laptop exactly as I found it and said nothing. I want to talk about what those weeks felt like, because I think that's the part of stories like this one that gets glossed over in favor of the dramatic reveal, the quiet, grinding middle where you're living 2 lives simultaneously. I went to work. I sat in conference rooms walking executives through discrepancies in their quarterly filings. The exact same analytical process, applied to numbers instead of people. That some part of my mind was running continuously in the background about my own life. I came home and made dinner with a woman I loved, or had loved. Or was trying to determine whether I still loved, and I asked about her day. And she told me about showings that may or may not have happened. And I nodded, and we ate, and none of it felt entirely real. I didn't fall apart during this stretch. I want to be honest about that, the same way I've tried to be honest about everything else here. There was no dramatic breakdown, no scene of me sitting on a bathroom floor. What existed instead was a low, constant hum of grief running alongside a careful, deliberate process, the two things occupying the same space without either one canceling the other out. I want to mention one more small thing from that stretch, because it stayed with me longer than it probably should have. Sabrina and I had a dog, an aging beagle named Chester who'd been with us since our 2nd year of marriage. Around this same period, Chester started greeting a specific set of clothing, a particular blazer of Sabrina's. A specific pair of shoes, with an odd, agitated bark he didn't direct at anything else in the house. The kind of reaction dogs sometimes have to unfamiliar scent left behind on fabric. I noticed it 3 separate times before I understood what it likely meant. Sabrina noticed it too, eventually, and started keeping that blazer in the garage instead of the hall closet. I didn't say anything about it at the time. I just added it, quietly, to the growing list of small, specific things that no longer matched the story I was still technically choosing to believe. The turning point came on a Thursday morning, roughly 9 weeks after the conversation with Ruth. Sabrina left early for a Riverton walkthrough she said would run until early afternoon. I had a scheduled audit review that morning that got postponed at the last minute due to a client's scheduling conflict, leaving me with an unplanned window. I want to be clear, I didn't set out that morning with any concrete plan. I simply had time, and an idea occurred to me that I couldn't set back down once it had. I drove to the address I'd seen on her laptop screen 4 days earlier, the off-market Colonial in Riverton. Her car was in the driveway. Beside it, a black sedan I didn't recognize. I sat parked half a block away for nearly 20 minutes, engine off. Feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the exact physical sensation of a hypothesis being confirmed. Against my own will, I didn't approach the house. I didn't need to. I drove to a diner a few miles away and sat with a cup of coffee I never touched. Letting myself feel the full weight of it for the first time since Ruth had said that name in the grocery store parking lot. I remember the diner in more detail than the moment probably deserves. A laminated menu with a coffee ring already on it before mine, a waitress who asked twice if I wanted a refill and seemed, on some level, to understand from my face that this wasn't a conversation I wanted to have. I sat there for the better part of an hour, watching cars move through the intersection outside the window. Running through 9 years of a marriage in a way that felt less like grief and more like an audit, cataloging which memories still felt true and which ones, in light of what I now knew, might have been quietly compromised the entire time. Had the Portugal trip been real, or had some version of this already been happening by then? Had the sticky notes on the bathroom mirror meant what I'd always assumed they meant? Or had I simply never had a reason to look closer? I didn't arrive at answers to most of those questions that day. I just sat with them, the way you sit with a discrepancy in a ledger before you understand its full shape, patient. Uncomfortable, unwilling yet to draw a conclusion the evidence hadn't fully supported. That weekend, while Sabrina was at what she described as an open house, I used a piece of software I keep for professional reasons, passive network monitoring. The kind I sometimes use when a client suspects an internal actor is moving data off their systems without authorization. Our home router logged which devices connected where. It confirmed that Sabrina's personal phone had connected to a specific residential Wi-Fi network, one registered through a public utility lookup to a name I didn't recognize, Gordon Castellano, on 11 separate mornings over the preceding 4 months, always on days her calendar listed as client, confidential. I found the credit card statement 2 days after that, in a drawer of mail she hadn't yet sorted. Small charges at a hardware store and a home goods shop in Riverton. Nothing dramatic, but enough, cross-referenced against the Wi-Fi logs, to place her at that specific address on mornings she'd told me she was showing property across town. I hired a private investigator a former client had once recommended for a corporate matter, a retired insurance fraud investigator named Wendell Ash who did discreet personal work on the side. He was in his early 60s, unhurried in his manner, the kind of person who'd clearly spent decades learning not to react visibly to whatever a client told him. I gave him a name, an address, a pattern of days, and asked him to confirm what I already believed to be true. Because I needed something beyond my own logs and my own conclusions. I want to be straightforward with you, Wendell told me at our first meeting. In a small office above a hardware store that seemed to double as his workspace. Most people who come to me already know the answer. What they're really paying for is documentation solid enough that no one can talk them out of what they already believe. I can do that, but I want you to be sure that's what you actually want before we start. I told him it was. I remember that conversation more clearly than most of what followed, because it was the first time anyone had said out loud, plainly, what I'd been circling for weeks without quite naming it, that I wasn't hiring him to find something new. I was hiring him to make what I already knew undeniable, even to myself. It took Wendell 12 days. What he brought back confirmed a relationship, at that point roughly 7 months old, between Sabrina and a man named Gordon Castellano, 41 years old. A commercial contractor who, it turned out, was the actual owner of the off-market Colonial, a house he'd been slowly renovating for over a year, ostensibly as an investment flip. Wendell had photographs, time-stamped, Sabrina's car in the driveway on 6 separate mornings. Sabrina and Gordon at a restaurant across town on an evening she told me was a broker's mixer that, according to the venue's own event calendar, hadn't taken place that night at all. I'll tell you something I don't usually say to clients, Wendell added, sliding the folder across the desk toward me. This one wasn't especially difficult to document. Whoever was managing the concealment on her end wasn't being careful. I've worked cases that took me 3 times as long to build this clearly. That tells me something about how confident she was that no one would ever come looking. I sat with those photographs for 3 full days before doing anything else. I want to explain, one more time, why the delay mattered, because I think it's the difference between a reaction and a response. A reaction happens on someone else's timeline, shaped entirely by the moment they choose to force it. A response happens on your own timeline, once you understand the full shape of the thing you're responding to. During those 3 days, I did what my training tells me to do whenever a discrepancy is confirmed. I started tracing the money. Sabrina and I kept a joint investment account, built primarily from my income given the volatility of her commission-based earnings meant as a long-term retirement cushion. I pulled 6 months of statements and found, buried in transfers she'd have had no reason to think I'd notice, roughly $71,000 moved out over that period in amounts small enough to avoid triggering any of the automated alerts our bank's app would normally flag for large withdrawals, never more than $4.500 at a time, spaced out, always timed around days I had early client meetings that kept me out of the house before she Left. The money had landed, in stages, in an account at a credit union I didn't recognize. Opened 4 months earlier, solely in Sabrina's name. Further tracing, done by a forensic accountant colleague named Priya Deshmukh whom I trusted enough to bring in once I understood the scope, showed that roughly $38,000 of that total had gone directly into materials and labor invoices for the Riverton renovation. Invoices addressed to Gordon Castellano's contracting business. Paid from an account that, on paper, had nothing to do with him at all. In plain terms, Priya told me over the phone, her voice level in the specific way professionals get when they've delivered this kind of news more than once. Your wife has been financing another man's investment property using funds from your joint retirement account. Depending on how it's characterized in a divorce filing, that's not simply an infidelity issue. That's dissipation of marital assets, and it's traceable dollar for dollar. I asked her to walk me through the specifics, the way I'd walk a client through their own findings. Because I think some part of me needed the numbers laid out plainly to fully absorb what they meant. She sent over a spreadsheet that evening, color-coded by transfer date. Each entry cross-referenced against the corresponding invoice from Gordon's contracting business. This one, she noted on our call, $840. Logged in your joint account simply as transfer, savings reallocation. Lines up exactly with a lumber supply invoice dated the same week. This one, $1,100, matches a plumbing subcontractor payment 2 days later. She paused. Whoever set this up wasn't especially sophisticated about hiding it. They were relying on the assumption that no one on your end was looking closely enough to connect a joint account. Transfer to a contractor's invoice for a house neither of you owns. That detail, the assumption that no one was looking, stayed with me longer than almost anything else in the report. It wasn't just that Sabrina had hidden something. It was that she'd hidden it carelessly, confident enough in my inattention that she hadn't bothered to cover the trail with any real sophistication. I found that, in its own strange way, more painful than the affair itself. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a quiet, ongoing assumption that I wasn't paying enough attention to my own life to ever notice. I wrote that down and underlined it twice, the way I always do with numbers that matter. I spent those 3 days going through the motions of an ordinary week in a way that, looking back, feels almost surreal. I ran a client meeting that Wednesday for a manufacturing company reviewing a suspected inventory discrepancy. And I remember standing at their whiteboard, walking their controller through a variance analysis. Thinking distantly that I was applying the exact same discipline to their spreadsheet that I'd applied to my own life. For the past several weeks, find where the number stops matching reality. And follow that thread until it explains itself completely. There is a strange, specific comfort in competence, even competence pointed at something that hurts. It gave me somewhere steady to stand while the rest of me absorbed what I now knew for certain. I want to talk about the Tuesday night in the kitchen now, the moment that gives this story its title. Because I think the sequence of events leading up to it matters more than the moment itself. By that point, I'd had the full picture, the photographs, the Wi-Fi logs, the financial trace, for roughly 2 weeks. I hadn't said anything. I was still deciding how and when, still consulting quietly with an attorney. A composed, unhurried man named Julian Farrow, about what mattered legally in Illinois. How dissipation of marital assets gets treated in equitable distribution. What documentation would need to look like to hold up. Whether the joint account transfers alone would be sufficient or whether Priya's full trace would be required as a supporting exhibit. That Tuesday, Sabrina came home later than usual again, poured herself a glass of wine, and made some offhand comment about a difficult client that had kept her at a showing past 6. I remember the specific ordinariness of that evening right up until the moment it wasn't ordinary anymore, the sound of her keys landing in the ceramic dish by the door, Chester's tail thumping against the cabinet as he greeted her. The particular way the evening light came through the kitchen window at that hour. Low and amber, the same light that had fallen across 100 other ordinary Tuesday evenings in that same kitchen over 9 years. I asked, more directly than I had in months, whether that client's name was Gordon. I want to describe her face in that moment, because I've thought about it more than almost anything else in this story. There was a flicker, half a second, no more, where something like alarm crossed her expression. Then it smoothed over, replaced by something more practiced, more controlled. She laughed. That specific, confident, faintly pitying laugh I mentioned at the start of this. Daniel, she said, setting her wine glass down on the counter. I don't know what you think you know, but you're going to embarrass yourself chasing something that isn't there. There's no Gordon. You'll never find out anything because there's nothing to find. I let a beat of silence pass. Then I said, quietly, without any of the heat I might have expected to feel in that moment, I already have, Sabrina. 11 weeks ago, actually. I just hadn't decided yet how I wanted to tell you that I knew. I watched her face again, the specific, rapid recalibration of someone realizing, in real time, that the version of me she'd built her confidence around no longer existed. What are you talking about, she said, though her voice had already lost the certainty it carried 30 seconds earlier. Gordon Castellano, I said. The Colonial in Riverton. 11 mornings on your network logs. $71,000 out of our retirement account, 38 of it into his renovation invoices. I have photographs. I have bank records. I have an attorney who's already reviewed all of it. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The kitchen, which had felt ordinary 30 seconds earlier, the same kitchen where we'd cooked 100 Sunday dinners, where she used to read me the real estate section in that ridiculous radio voice, suddenly felt like the sight of something entirely different. You've been watching me, she said finally, her voice quieter now, the confidence gone out of it entirely. I've been paying attention, I said. There's a difference. You made the choice to hide something from me for 7 months. I made the choice to understand exactly what that something was before I said anything about it. She set her wine glass down harder than she probably meant to. So what happens now, she said, and I noted, even in that moment, that it wasn't phrased as a question directed at repairing anything. It was a request for the next set of facts, the way a client asks an auditor what happens now after a discrepancy's been confirmed, already moving toward damage control rather than toward the person across from her. Now, I said, I've already filed. Julian submitted the petition this morning. There's a preliminary asset freeze request attached to it, with Priya's forensic report as the supporting documentation. I wasn't going to have this conversation with you until the filing was already in motion. Because I've watched enough people rebuild a story overnight once they know someone's looking. I wasn't going to give you the chance. I want to be honest that I hadn't necessarily planned to say all of that in the kitchen that night. Some of it came out because the moment demanded it, because she'd laughed at me confidently, thinking there was nothing to find, and something in me needed her to understand immediately and completely, exactly how wrong that confidence had been. She didn't cry, not right away. What I remember most is the specific quiet that settled over the kitchen after that, not a comfortable silence, but the particular quality of quiet that exists when two people are recalculating simultaneously everything they thought they understood about the last several months. I need to call someone, she said finally, picking up her phone. That's fine, I said. I'm going to stay at my brother's for a few days. I think we both need the space to let this actually land. I packed a bag that night and drove to my brother Theo's place across town. Theo's 35, an physician, the kind of person who's seen enough of people's worst nights to have very little patience for slow building denial. He didn't ask many questions when I arrived. He just made up the guest room and told me, in his characteristically blunt way, whatever you need to process this week, take it. I'm not going anywhere. I didn't sleep much that first night. I sat in Theo's kitchen with a glass of water I didn't drink, replaying the exact moment her laugh had faltered, the exact half-second where the confidence drained out of her face. I want to be honest that there was no triumph in it, not that night. What existed instead was something closer to exhaustion, the specific, hollowed-out feeling of having carried a truth alone for 11 weeks and finally setting it down. Even if setting it down meant watching a 9-year marriage end in a kitchen over a glass of wine. My mother called 2 days later, having heard the outline of it from Theo. She didn't ask many questions either, at first, just told me. In the quiet, steady tone she reserves for actual crises rather than manufactured ones. That she was glad I told Theo instead of sitting on it alone. And that whatever I needed, practically or otherwise, I only had to ask. I remember being surprised, in a small way, by how much that plain, unadorned support helped, compared to how much I might have expected to need it. Sometimes the people who love you best don't need the whole story before they decide to show up for you. They just need to know you're standing somewhere unsteady. I told my mother the fuller version about a week later, once some of the initial shock had settled into something closer to clarity. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd always listened to hard things. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she said, I always thought you two moved a little too fast toward the version of a life that looked good from the outside. I never said anything, because it wasn't my place, and because for a long time it really did seem to be working. She paused. I'm sorry it stopped working in a way that hurt you this much. At work, I told almost no one the specifics. My direct supervisor, a measured woman named Constance Rayburn who'd mentored me for most of my career, noticed something was off within the first week and asked, gently, whether I needed to take some personal time. I told her, in the general terms I was comfortable with, that I was going through a divorce and might need some flexibility around a few upcoming dates for legal proceedings. She didn't ask for details, just told me to let her know what I needed and to take the time without worrying about the optics of it. I found, in the months that followed, that keeping my professional life compartmentalized from the personal unraveling happening at home was one of the few things that gave the whole period any real structure. A place where the rules were clear, the problems were solvable, and nothing depended on trusting anyone's account of where they'd been on a given morning. The following weeks moved with a kind of procedural momentum I was, admittedly, better equipped to handle than most people would have been, given the nature of my work. Julian filed the formal petition the same week, citing dissipation of marital assets alongside the standard grounds. The court granted a temporary restraining order on the joint retirement account within 4 days. Based largely on Priya's documentation, a clean, methodical trace that left very little room for alternative explanation. Sabrina retained an attorney, a sharp, aggressive woman named Carol Denby, who initially pushed back hard on the dissipation claim, arguing the Riverton transfers represented a legitimate personal investment Sabrina was entitled to make independently. Julian's response was simple. He introduced the invoices directly tied to Gordon Castellano's business. The Wi-Fi logs placing Sabrina at the property on 11 separate occasions during hours she'd represented to me, and, by extension, to any shared understanding of our finances, as client work. Carol Denby's argument didn't survive that exhibit for long. I want to talk about Gordon Castellano for a moment, because what happened to him, while not something I orchestrated directly, matters to how this story resolved. Wendell Ash's background research, done as part of his original investigation, turned up that Gordon had financed at least one other renovation project 2 years earlier using funds from a woman he'd been involved with at the time, a detail that had never surfaced publicly. Quietly settled between the two of them before it went any further. It wasn't identical to what happened with Sabrina, but it was close enough in shape that Wendell flagged it as a pattern. Worth noting, I didn't use that information directly in my own filing, it wasn't strictly relevant to my case. But I did mention it to Julian, off the record, mostly because I wanted, at minimum, to understand whether Sabrina had been an isolated target or one entry in a longer, quieter pattern. Julian's read, and mine, was the latter. I never contacted Gordon directly. I didn't need to. Whatever unfolded in his life following the end of the Riverton renovation, which stalled out, according to public permitting records, roughly 2 months after my petition was filed. Likely once the financing dried up, happened independently of anything I did. The hearing took place in early June, roughly 10 weeks after that Tuesday night in the kitchen. I arrived 20 minutes early, in a suit I hadn't worn since a client presentation the previous fall, and sat at the plaintiff's table reviewing my notes as the courtroom slowly filled. Sabrina came in with Carol Denby a few minutes later, dressed carefully. Understated, the image of a professional woman navigating an unfair situation, I noted. Almost against my will, the specific effort in it, the way she'd clearly calibrated her appearance for exactly this audience. Judge Adrienne Castile, a measured woman with a reputation among Chicago family law attorneys for reading every exhibit thoroughly before either side spoke a word, went through Priya's forensic report line by line during the proceedings, occasionally pausing to ask Priya direct, specific questions about methodology that Priya answered without hesitation. When Carol Denby attempted to frame the Riverton transfers as emotional distance within the marriage justifying independent financial decisions, Judge Castile's response was direct. Emotional distance, she said, removing her reading glasses and setting them on the bench in a gesture that silenced the room more effectively than raising her voice would have, does not authorize one spouse to unilaterally finance a third party's business venture using retirement funds accumulated jointly over 9 years. I'd like Ms. Whitfield to explain, specifically, what she believed she was entitled to do with $71,000 that was not, in fact, solely hers to allocate. Sabrina didn't have an answer that survived the question. She looked, for the first time in the entire proceeding, less like the composed professional she'd arrived as and more like someone watching a version of events she'd rehearsed failed to hold up against a room that wasn't interested in performance. The court ordered full recovery of the dissipated funds back into the marital estate pending final division. Awarded me a disproportionate share of the remaining retirement account in recognition of the documented dissipation, and noted in its written order that the pattern of concealment, the falsified calendar entries, the misrepresented showings, weighed against Sabrina's credibility more broadly in the proceedings. I want to be honest about how it felt walking out of that courtroom, because I don't think this story is well served by a clean, uncomplicated sense of victory. It wasn't victory exactly. It was more like the specific, grounded relief of watching a structure that had been quietly, deliberately undermined get tested formally and hold, in the end, on the strength of documentation rather than emotion. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later. I kept the house, one I'd purchased 2 years before we married. Never fully retitled during the marriage due to what turned out to be, ironically, an oversight on Sabrina's part rather than mine, one her own initial financial disclosures during the proceedings inadvertently confirmed. I moved through the following months with the same steady, unglamorous rhythm that had gotten me through the 11 weeks of quiet investigation before any of this became formal. Work remained a genuine anchor. I picked up a complex audit engagement that spring for a manufacturing client with a suspected internal embezzlement scheme, the kind of problem with a clear, discoverable answer sitting somewhere in the ledgers if you looked carefully enough. And I found real relief in that kind of clarity after months of a much murkier, more personal kind of investigation. Theo and I fell into a rhythm of Sunday dinners at his place. Something neither of us had done with any regularity in years. And I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, looking forward to them the way I used to look forward to those Sunday Mornings on the back porch, different in every specific detail, but similar in the quiet, steady comfort of a routine that asked nothing performative of me. Chester came with me when I moved fully back into the house alone. He'd stopped barking at unfamiliar scent within a few weeks of Sabrina's things being gone entirely. And there was something quietly restorative in watching him settle, uncomplicated, into a house that finally matched what it smelled and sounded like on the inside. I ran into Ruth Holloway again, about 5 months after the divorce was finalized. At a different grocery store this time, a coincidence that felt. Given how the whole story had started with her mentioning Riverton in a parking lot, almost too neat to be accidental. She looked genuinely uncomfortable seeing me at first, until I told her. Honestly, that I didn't hold anything against her, that mentioning Riverton hadn't been a betrayal. Just an ordinary comment that happened to matter more than either of us could have known at the time. I still think about that conversation, she admitted. I didn't know what I was actually telling you. Neither did I, at first, I said. But I'm glad you did. She asked, carefully, how I was doing. And I told her, honestly, that I was doing better than I'd expected to. Months earlier, sitting in that diner with a cup of coffee I never touched. She nodded, said she was glad, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that Sabrina had left the brokerage entirely a few months back, a detail I hadn't sought out and didn't especially need. But one that landed, quietly, as one more small confirmation that the life Sabrina had been building around that laugh in the kitchen hadn't survived contact with the truth any better than the marriage had. I want to close this the way I've been thinking about it since that Tuesday night, not with anger. Though I felt plenty of that in the months that followed, and not with a tidy sense of vindication. Though there was some of that too. What I keep coming back to, instead, is the specific quality of that laugh, confident. Dismissive, sure of itself in a way that assumed I hadn't been paying attention. I understand now why she believed that. For most of our marriage, I'd been the quiet one, the steady one. The one who let things go rather than pressing for uncomfortable answers. I've thought, too, about what it means that a marriage can hold two entirely different realities inside it at once. That Sabrina could laugh at me over a wine glass believing herself fully in control of the story, while I stood across from her already holding the full weight of everything she thought she'd hidden. I don't think that says something uniquely damning about her. I think it says something true about how easily two people, even after 9 years, can end up living in separate versions of the same house without either one fully realizing it until the moment the versions collide. What she didn't account for was that steadiness and attentiveness aren't opposites. Some of us watch quietly not because we're not paying attention, but because we're paying closer attention than anyone around us realizes, and when the moment finally comes to say what we've seen, we say it once, clearly, with the documentation already in hand. And we don't need to raise our voice to be believed. She laughed and told me I'd never find out. I already had. I'd simply been waiting, the way I always wait, for the moment when the truth would do more good spoken than it ever could have done sitting quietly in a folder on my laptop, unused. That moment came on a Tuesday night in our kitchen, over a glass of wine she never finished. And it was the last conversation we ever had as a married couple, the only one. In the end, where I let her see exactly how much I'd known the entire time.